going to keep it lively here. I'm just going to briefly introduce each of our panelists, and each one of them will just have a few brief remarks, and then we're going to go into some deeper Q&A. So on my immediate left is Betty DeRoger. She's the Director of Aviation Planning and Strategy with the Massachusetts Port Authority. She has 20 years with the Port Authority, and she's responsible for landside, airside, ground transportation, environmental planning, air services development. She oversaw the planning and permitting for the new runway and the Centerfield taxiway and the promulgation of peak area pricing. So basically, if it flies, rolls, or walks at the airport, Betty's going to be looking at it. Next to Betty is Billy Glover. He's the Vice President of Aviation Strategy and Policy Integration for Boeing Commercial Airplanes. And he leads an enterprise-wide team responsible for shaping global policy on key issues affecting aviation, including domestic and international policy, environmental strategy, and product performance and safety and security. Prior to this, he led a team responsible for addressing environmental issues. Next to Billy, and the person who wins the award for traveling the farthest, I think, is Andrew Herdman, who is the Director General of the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines based in Kuala Lumpur. AAPA is the leading trade organization for international airlines based in the Asia-Pacific region and represents 17 carriers that transport more than 285 million passengers and 10 million tons of cargo annually. And of course, AAPA works closely with regulators and other industry associations on aeropolitical issues and sustainable growth of international civil aviation. And on my far left is Professor Ian Waits, who's the head of the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. And he's also the director of the Partnership for Air Transportation Noise and Emissions Reduction, which is an FAA, NASA, Transport Canada sponsored center of excellence. And his principal areas of interest are the modeling and evaluation of climate, local air quality, noise impacts of aviation. Aviation doesn't have any noise impacts, including the assessment of technological, operational, and policy options for mitigating these impacts. So Betty, if you'd like to lead us off with just a brief sort of summary position here, that'd be great.
Well, airports are responsible for providing the infrastructure for moving the goods and passengers in safe, efficient, and an environmentally sound manner. That said, we, in fact, of the facilities that are owned by an airport, we generate very little environmental impact compared to the whole impact of the entire transportation business at an airport. In fact, for Massport, we've figured out that we generate about 2% of that impact. That said, airports across the country are aggressively moving forward to reduce their environmental footprint, whether that's using less energy, using alternative energy, such as solar and wind power, whether it's promulgating design, sustainable design guidelines and mandates, whether it's providing improvements to ground access to increase HOV use, and publishing our environmental footprint data, trying to make our business more transparent. We're moving aggressively along that front across the board in the US. I'd say that, that said, the most difficult aspect of our work is working with regulators and environmental groups and community advocates around environmental impacts associated with noise and air quality in particular, that which we do not generate or control for the most part. Looking forward, next gen RNAV, RNP, ADS-B will clearly provide tremendous benefit for the industry. Individual airports may experience that differently. Concentration versus dispersion will come to the forefront for sure for individual airports with RNAV and RNP operations. I have to say that airports across the board are really looking to see lower, more stringent noise emissions, and likewise for hazardous air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. And I think as an industry going forward, we need to do more in those areas.
Great. Billy?
Okay, Perry, I'll try to keep my remarks very brief because I know you have great questions. This morning in the forecast summary that Jan presented, on one of the slides there was a little caveat down at the bottom that said, this is based on an unconstrained look at the world, demand only, and assumes there's no problem with infrastructure and environmental impact, or words to that effect. And what that means to me is that we've been doing a fair job so far, otherwise wouldn't put that assumption in our forecast, but it also means that there is a lot of hard work ahead in order to keep up with that growth profile that is forecast from an economic standpoint. And if you don't know what hard work is, it's the difference between innovation and implementation. So it's the gap in between those two. I think we're very good at innovation, and we get to the story eventually on implementation, but a lot of work to do in between. And basically it's going to require more attention to airframe and engine technology, which we're doing now, and to address some of the things Betty mentioned. It's going to require continuing to implement and innovate on air traffic with next gen and those kind of transformational implementations, along with improvements in operations and maintenance to decrease environmental impact. And then finally, changing the fuel to more sustainable, clean fuel source in the future. All areas that Boeing is working on, along with many others in the industry. So we think the inspiration's there. We just have the hard work to do to get to implementation of all those things. And I think we're up to the challenge.
Great.
Well, I'll just pick up on a couple of those themes and expand on it from an Asian perspective. This is a part of the mass transit industry. You have getting on for 2.5 billion people transported by air annually, 7 million a day. It's an integral part of the way the global economy runs, as you can see from experiments where you shut down Europe for a week and see what life's like without aviation, or you shut down a key airport because of snow, an experiment that's been tried in various continents. And it reminds us just how aviation is an integral part of a global economy. But we have to grow sustainably. Much of the growth in the industry is driven by big growing markets in Asia. Asia already represents about 1/4 of global aviation, and it's headed towards 1/3. So we take these things very seriously, and we talk about sustainability. Billy has mentioned the technology, operations, infrastructure improvements. Those are generating fuel efficiency improvements of between 1.5% and 2% per annum, but unconstrained demand is growing at about 5% per annum. So we have a gap in terms of neutralizing our carbon impact, our carbon footprint, in terms of growth, and trying to decouple the growth of demand and satisfying that demand from emissions. And that's the tough work that Billy's talking about. I'm pleased to say it's the industry that's leading. A cross-industry coalition of airlines, manufacturers, airports, ANSPs are working together. We do have a common strategy, and it is delivering results year in, year out. But we can get to this later. But on top of that, there is the whole question of, can you assume unconstrained demand? Clearly not. Somewhere in your forecasting, you have to implicitly or otherwise assume a carbon price and an emissions price. And we know how difficult it is to forecast oil prices, and forecasting emissions prices is even harder. And you've got to add the two together to know what the future holds. So the problem for any forecasting, as we're looking at in this conference in particular, the problem for any forecasting is what assumptions do you make about oil pricing, carbon pricing, energy pricing. And it's a mistake to project, extrapolate unconstrained growth, because it gives us, it argues against our sense of sustainable growth. I think what we need to factor in is all of the technology, all of the operational improvements, and some assumptions about carbon pricing, and still show that this industry will grow responsibly and deliver not just economic and social benefit, but also in an environmentally responsible way.
Great, thanks. Ian.
Great, thank you. First is a bit of perspective. I've had the benefit over several years of working with some exceptional people in the FAA Office of Environment and Energy, notably Carl Burleson and Loris Maurice, and I understand a little bit about the policy challenges they face. I've also had the benefit of working with some exceptional researchers who are trying to offer up solutions and options, so I understand a little bit about their perspective as well. And before I tell you what I think the key challenge is for the industry, I do want to credit the FAA for standing up a very robust research effort that's focused on trying to understand what the impacts are and help better inform their decisions, because I think there's some very significant costs and benefits that come with either doing the wrong thing or the right thing when it comes to aviation and the environment, and perhaps the best thing that we can do is make better decisions with it. So I want to credit the FAA for a very robust effort in that area. To the question of what the most important challenges are in the environmental domain for aviation and how we ought to mitigate them, I think the greatest challenge facing aviation in this area is balancing what people want with what people want. And now you're all thinking, wow, how do they vet these panelists, right? So let me try and redeem myself. On the one hand, as we're all aware, people want to have, fast, efficient travel. They want it to be cheap. From an economic perspective, they'd like us to do the most economically efficient things when it comes to the environment as well. So if it's a high-cost endeavor to make environmental gains in aviation, they'd prefer that we would make investments elsewhere so that we can maximize the few dollars we have and minimize travel costs. So that's sort of a very rational perspective. However, the other thing that we want is that we'd like aviation to make dramatic reductions in environmental impact, right? And if we're going to make dramatic reductions in aviation, given the high abatement costs, it's going to cost us something. And ultimately, that's going to feed into making travel more expensive. It's going to have impacts on demand, right? And the difference between those two perspectives, from a very sort of rational, do the most economically efficient path, and dramatic reductions, is huge. It's the difference between perhaps 100% growth in the next 20 years of an emissions footprint to a 50% reduction of an emissions footprint. Right? So charting our course between those two endpoints, because most certainly we will end up between those two endpoints, charting our course between those two is important. Right? We've got to decide where do we want to be. And I think industry has put forth a proposal, right? Roughly splits the difference. Right? Now, ultimately, that's going to have more of an impact on demand and travel costs than if we followed a pure rational economic approach and said, aviation is a very high-cost place to make changes. Let's invest elsewhere where it's cheaper. Right? So ultimately, that'll have an impact, but it'll allow us to achieve the two things that we want in some balanced way. So I think the greatest challenge for the industry going forward is to articulate those two endpoints clearly so that people can decide, well, where should we be between them? Once you decide the course that you want between those two endpoints, the aviation industry is marvelous at achieving great things. But that decision of, where do you want to be? Do you want to have unconstrained growth, or do you want 50 to 80% reductions in emissions footprint? That's the big challenge that we face, is making the right choice there. So.
Great, thanks. Well, one of the things that I think we heard at every panel is we went down the list of things that could affect the forecast, and the last thing on each thing was the environmental issue. And Ian, both you and Andrew touched on the idea of the industry having put forth a proposal, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. The industry proposal, which has been put forward basically by the the aerospace side of it, Boeing, Airbus, the airlines, the airports, and the air navigation service providers, is basically for a 1.5% improvement in efficiency between now and 2020, and then carbon neutral growth through 2050. And then by 2050, we're at 50% net CO2 emissions compared to 2005. This is not something that's been universally accepted. ICAO has come close to it. I think there've been, you know, but the bigger question is, are those numbers really achievable? I mean, we basically want to have unconstrained growth. I mean, we want the market to decide whether there's growth or not. We don't want it constrained by outside things, whatever they may be. So the question is, are these goalposts and these targets that the industry has set, are they achievable? And if
I think they're absolutely achievable, and I think the innovation track for between here and 2020 is pretty well set in terms of, you know, the volume and the products that'll be available, the technology largely that'll be available. So that's pretty clear. The path from 2020 to 2050 is, of course, much less certain, but I think the potential is certainly there to implement. The big question is financing for some of the things, especially on regards to the fuel piece of it. We know how to do that, a lot of that, technically, not all of it. We know how to do a lot of it technically, but getting the production facilities, getting the supply chain going as a matter of finance, which, you know, gets over to Ian's comment about, you know, do you spend the money here or somewhere else? And kind of segueing into the argument there is that that's the only thing we can do for aviation. So if we're going to reinvent fuel, we should apply it to aviation rather than something else.
what about, when we talk about biofuel, I mean, there have been any number of tests done. We've demonstrated that it's an excellent replacement. It's a drop-in replacement. It actually burns a little cleaner and maybe a little more efficiently. But we can't get to the next, we're at a chicken and egg stage where, you know, no one knows what's going to come next. We've got some demo products. I mean, what is the time frame that we can, and I know that it's compressed tremendously from, if we had asked 5 years ago, we'd say, well, 2025, 2030, maybe at the earliest. But where are we now in that? And then I'd like to follow up with the idea that there seems to be sort of a rising on the environmental side, a sort of, well, even these second generation biofuels aren't truly green. They really don't have a life cycle that's better than fossil fuel, or they're still taking away land that could be used for other things. So maybe any of the panelists want to jump in on either of those two. Time bomb questions there.
I think you want to be careful to be realistic, that there are many, many uncertainties in the biofuels area. And I think there's uncertainties about supply. There's uncertainties about cost for it. And it may be that when all is said and done, that's not a good idea, right? You may learn, you know, through a lot of hard research that, you know, using biomass in airplanes is not economically or thermodynamically the most efficient thing to do, right? And then the rational approach is to use it someplace else where it is more economically and thermodynamically efficient. But, you know, Billy said, but it's all we can do in aviation. Well, there's another choice. You could sort of say, well, we're going to, you know, do less in aviation because we can do more elsewhere if we apply it. That's a hard thing to do because people have a sense that, no, we really do want to have these dramatic reductions. I'm actually a big fan of the biofuels research because you've got to do the research to get the innovation engine running and see what's possible, right? But I would hope that we would leave the really the decision open that if once we, you know, chase down that path, if it doesn't look good, you know, we ought to do the more rational thing.
I think it's been shown to be good for certain situations. It's on a very rapid improvement path, both technically and economically. It's not all the way there yet. And there isn't just one solution. It's a series of things. You know, this process, this feedstock, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one. Of course, there are terrible ways to do it, but I think there are also proving out to be some very good ways, and you have to have that research work, a thorough understanding to know how to navigate that.
What about this whole question about, well, they're not really green? I mean, is that a legitimate beef, or?
That's a legitimate concern. And it certainly has to be looked at with eyes wide open. As I said, it can be done very well or very badly, and that's one of the aspects of doing it very badly if you don't take into account those questions and answer them fully.
Yeah, but I think the question to ask and answer is not, since it's a scarce resource, so you need to compare how we could use it in aviation relative to other uses. So the question is not in the absolute, is it good for aviation, but how does the aviation use of it compare to other uses that you could have? And you know, frankly, how does the aviation, you know, research engine compare to other research engines for bringing it forward? I mean, that's one of the things that's really in our, you know, pocket in aviation, that we do know how to innovate quite well, right? So I think those are the questions to ask. Is not to take that question in the absolute, but to take a broader view.
And I think you need to get beyond establishing the technical validity of biofuels, which is now far advanced, close to certification. The question of legitimacy in ecological terms is doing a life cycle analysis, and that's painstaking work because it's feedstock dependent, chemical pathway dependent. That work is now being done, and it is showing that even taking into account land use change, water use, competition for food, or alternative uses of the land, you still get a CO2 life cycle benefit. So that work is now being done, is being validated for particular biofuels. I'd like to come back to a point that Ian made about you know, choose your trajectory. I'm not sure we should be choosing the trajectory of the outcome. It's not the industry that should decide its future size. What we need to do is put in place incentives and prices and let the marketplace, let the consumers decide, because as Ian says, it's about trade-offs. And that's not about wise men making trade-offs between one industry and another. It's putting price signals into the marketplace on carbon pricing and then letting the people decide which things they want to grow in terms of demand and which they want to shrink. I happen to believe that because of the high abatement costs and because of the high value of aviation that people place on aviation, all the signs are that they won't suppress their demand for aviation growth. They will trade off making carbon savings elsewhere. But that's, you know, that's not something we should be taking upon ourselves to decide. But that's my own view as to how it will map out. But as long as there's no explicit carbon price, then the industry is open to the accusation that it's acting as if it's unconstrained growth and is therefore irresponsible. Coming back to your point about targets, I agree with Billy that the 1.5% per annum is eminently achievable. We're well on track to do that. The problem is that within ICAO, they think 2% per annum compounded. Right. And you say, well, what's the difference? 1.5, 2. It's a big difference. You know, 1.5 compounded over 20 years compared to 2%. 2% is achievable, but we need governments to come to the party in terms of air traffic control, efficiencies and investments, and it needs a bit more in terms of the technological development. Personally, I think 2% is probably still achievable, and we have a roadmap to do that, to work towards it. Carbon neutral growth in 2020, technology, operations, infrastructure are not going to be enough. It's going to have to involve alternative fuels and the embedded carbon credits, or some other form of carbon credits being purchased from other sectors. As Ian was saying, they might be cheaper elsewhere. Although it's tempting to say, let's keep it in the industry, it may be that there are cheaper trade-offs to be made. The key point I want to make about carbon neutral growth in 2020 is this is not an area where the industry can lead. We can set the direction and hint to governments that this is the way we ought to go, but as far as putting a price on carbon is concerned, the industry can't do that. Only governments can do that through emissions trading frameworks or through carbon taxes. But the industry itself can't volunteer that for antitrust reasons. So we need political leadership, and frankly, we're not getting it. Everyone agrees climate change is one hell of a problem, and it really ought to be tackled. But when it comes down to it, someone wants someone else to do the heavy lifting and pay for it. And we've seen 15 years of discussion at UNFCCC, almost as many years of discussion in ICAO, and it revolves around this question of who's going to do most of the heavy lifting. And in the end, that means the pace of development is extremely slow as far as that thinking is concerned. But I do stress that the industry is not being held back as far as technology, operations, infrastructure, fuel efficiency. We're pushing ahead full speed. And then on biofuels, it's the industry that's pushing ahead as fast as we can. But as far as economic measures are concerned, it's a question of the lack of political leadership, and it's a massive collective action problem, particularly on the international stage.
And we'll come back to that, but I wanted to go locally because when we talk about, think globally, a lot of people may be thinking globally about climate change, but locally they're more concerned about noise, or if it's a local regulator, it may be water runoff or de-icer fluid. So Betty, I wanted to ask, we know that things like performance-based navigation, RNP, RNAV, are really key to increasing capacity, but also to improving the efficiency and reducing emissions from aviation. But how important is it to have the local community involved in that? Because you can have a RNP approach that's so perfect, it comes over the same house at the same time every morning.
Yeah, exactly. We've actually have a study underway in Boston now, looking at RNAVs and RNPs and CDAs, and interestingly, we've implemented RNAV departures actually, and have seen successes in reducing noise, but we're seeing the successes in reducing noise on the further out communities. So we are much more, and airports generally are much more engaged with communities who are in a 50-55 DNL than where historically we've always been with 70 and 65 DNL. Communities that are further out are much more engaged now because of the volume and the increase in the number of operations. And so we have these real trade-offs between inner communities, outer communities, concentration versus dispersion. And I don't think that there's one, I know there's not one answer. It really is an individual by individual airport based on land use around that airport. So we're seeing gains for further out, no gains for close in thus far. The communities are, from our perspective, hugely engaged in emissions as well, and in particular on the local level with public health. So we're spending a lot of time looking at health impacts associated with emissions. We have a study underway, several airports do, just measuring emissions. The state has a public health study underway looking at trying to discern what the health impacts are of emissions. I think this is a growing concern, and in part because we don't know how to talk about it yet as an industry. The science isn't very clear, and it takes a long time to develop a database, and therefore communities are looking at planes, seeing emissions, smelling emissions, and coming to conclusions about public health impacts of this industry that are probably pretty much off the mark. But as an industry, we have no way to talk about it yet. And I think that that's a growing problem on a local basis. Noise is still the key issue, but emerging clearly is not just greenhouse gases, but public health.
And if I remember correctly, after 9/11, when basically the entire world's industry was shut down, some airport in Asia, might have been Hong Kong, actually did a study and found that they could measure no difference in the local emissions, even though aviation wasn't running. But I imagine if you go to the local community and say that, they'll throw their properly plastic water bottles at you and chase you out of the room. But Ian, is this something that in your research you're addressing and dealing with?
Certainly. So we've worked for the last 8 years, I think, through the FAA, several universities, Harvard School of Public Health and MIT and University of North Carolina, several different universities have been involved in trying to understand what the health impacts are related to aviation air quality. And you're right, it's specific to airports, so you really have to do it airport by airport by airport, and you have to do your simulations year-long in order to understand it. And aviation's contributions to the overall health impacts are very, very small, fractions of a percent. However, those can still be quite significant impacts at a community level. And one of the things that I would like to advance more, so let me give you a specific example. My mother lives, under the Newark airspace, right? And there's a redesign there, and it caused some noise to move from one place to another place. It also saved, a good bit of fuel. There were some safety implications to it. And of course, that all ended up with, lawsuits and the GAO involved and things. In all of those discussions, it was all about how much did the industry save in fuel, right? So the fuel savings were credited to, the quote industry. Right. They were winners. And then how much were the noise impacts moved around in the communities? That was basically the tenor of the discussion, if you look at it. And there's people here who know more about it than I, but that was the tenor of the discussion. Though I'm the one who gets the phone calls from my mom. And there were two benefits to that weren't clearly articulated in all of the planning and public discussions. There were the climate change benefits for saving the fuel, and there were the local air quality benefits. And I think that if that was made, very tangible and specific to people to say, yeah, we did move noise around a little bit, and some places it went up and some places it went down, but all of you benefited from local air quality improvements, and all of us benefited from climate change improvements, that maybe it would have been a little bit better discussion. I don't know. Those are difficult discussions to have, but I would like to see some of those questions more clearly articulated. I think through the FAA, the tools exist to do that now. So that's the kind of thing that we can help with.
I think that's right.
And I think to add to that,
Reframing is
I'm sure that any savings on fuel were passed on in lower fares.
Right. But
so
it
this
wasn't.
industry is a pass-through mechanism for fuel cost.
Yep, you have it exactly right, but it wasn't credited to that people are saying it was credited to somehow the industry won and people lost without really seeing that it's all together in the same community.
I completely agree. Reframing that debate so that it's understood by the folks that live close to airports is critical to airports' ability to bring infrastructure or change flight patterns to accommodate growth in the industry. And I think we're behind that curve. I don't think we've framed it, and I don't think we've put together the information in a clear enough way to inform the general public. At the moment, we look like the industry looks like and airports look like they're just a big negative in terms of environment, and that's a problem.
I was going to say, I think that the whole idea of the way clean skies over Seattle has been pitched, isn't that?
Loved it.
Sort of clean skies over Boston kind of thing you could think
it.
about. I want to come back to something, Andrew, you were talking about, which is sort of international incentives that someone has to sort of step up. The airlines can't really set a price for carbon. But you also have the issue of sort of people doing it regionally. So I know your members, U.S. Airlines as well, are very excised over what's going on in Europe, where indeed a governmental power has stepped up. They have said, look, we are going to address aviation's impact, and this is how we're going to do it. So on the one hand, we want someone to do it, but we don't want it done on that level because then we get into a problem. But where do we stand on that? It looks like the emissions trading scheme is going to happen. We talk about letting the market decide. In the UK, the government has decided, the market, that they'll help with a tax. And in Germany, the government has decided we're going to help people make an informed choice about the environment by putting a tax on it. And the same thing in Austria. So I guess in a way there's kind of a danger of how people choose to interpret how they want to place a market incentive in place.
Yeah, the Europeans frustrated by the lack of progress internationally, but have jumped the gun, gone ahead and implemented EU ETS. It kicks in right now, and anybody who flies to, from, or within Europe will then be subject to paying essentially a carbon tax, emissions trading charge. We object to that. The American carriers object to that, fundamentally because we believe the Europeans have acted outside the Chicago Convention in terms of taxing foreign operators, particularly as it applies to the length of the journey. And it's a two-way tax. It's a round-trip tax. So it's likely to trigger, one, legal challenges, which is still pending. Secondly, it's likely to trigger retaliatory action by other governments, saying if you're going to tax it, so will we. And within ICAO, we've been arguing as industry very strongly for the idea of a global consensus and a global scheme of some sort, at least some consistency. Again, people are receptive to that idea, but making it happen is extremely difficult. So we're at a standoff now. Once the invoices start appearing in the next few months for the EU ETS, members, airlines will be paying under protest. If you don't pay, the sanctions against you include not allowing you to land at European airports, so that'll concentrate the minds. But if that triggers retaliatory actions, then you could get into essentially what's a trade dispute, a trade war between countries, and it'll have it'll go through the courts, but in the end it'll be solved politically. Hopefully we can avoid some of that acrimony. 3 years ago at the ICAO Assembly, it was Europe versus the rest. Everybody was opposed to the Europeans. At the Assembly a few months ago, there was more of a consensus, but we're still left with the fact the Europeans came out of that Assembly saying they would proceed with the EU ETS. So there's a lot of unhappiness about that. Other countries are introducing ETS, but on a domestic basis. In New Zealand, Australia's talked about it. If countries want to do it domestically, that's within their power, their sovereign right to do so. It doesn't distort competition because domestic markets are closed off to foreigners anyway. So it's quite consistent to have domestic initiatives. The problem with the European scheme is it's not limited to intra-European. It touches on everything. And there's a discrimination against ultra-long-haul carriers flying from Europe all the way to Asia, as opposed to flying just out of Europe to the Middle East, because you only pay on the first leg. So it's distortive of competition, and I don't think it's the way forward. But the Europeans retort that it's law. They've done the hard work of designing the scheme, and in the absence of anything substantive on a global level through ICAO or UNFCCC, they think they should press ahead.
Right. And Perry, you mentioned these other taxes that are labeled as environmental taxes, when in fact they have little or nothing to do with environmental. They're really just treasury restoration. Right. And in fact, many of them are implemented in distortion ways, like Andrew talked about, where they're set up in zones, so they discriminate against long-haul traffic, for instance. So it's quite disturbing to see those things happen when we have really done enormous work as an industry to reduce our carbon footprint and have a commitment to go forward, and a lot of innovation going towards that, and to see taxation and these schemes set up that are distortive and not really helping anyone other than the treasuries, perhaps, of the governments.
Talking about a little bit about what the industry's done. In effect, I guess in 2010, CAPE agreed on a sort of to set a timetable for a CAFE standard, if it were, for new airplanes. Sort of a miles per flight, a fuel efficiency standard. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that's progressing?
Sure. Well, it's not hopefully it won't be a CAFE standard. What's being discussed at the working group level, and they have the task to design a metric and propose an implementation path before the next assembly. So pretty short schedule. And they are looking at metrics that get down to the basic fundamentals of how productive is this machine at handling fuel, at getting the work done for a given amount of fuel, and trying to look at these various metric options, do they really track technology? Do they make sense from a technology standpoint? And make sure they don't introduce some other distortion or cause an impact on basically business models that might be different from airline to airline or market to market, but really something like most other type certification standards apply to the technology and whether it meets the goals. Performance standard.
And that's a 2013 hope for?
That 2013 is the goal that the tasking from ICAO set.
One of the things we heard earlier today, I forget who said it, but the open rotor would not be the next engine of choice. And I don't know if you agree, but what's interesting about that is that there's no denying that the open rotor provides a fuel saving that is, simply unbelievable in terms of efficiency. So the real issue with the open rotor is operational and noise. So Betty, this comes back to you again. We get caught in a situation where it's great to be fuel efficient, but not in my backyard.
The trade-off.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, local communities would still tell you, in our experience, that noise is still the driver for them.
And so how much of that, Ian, in the work you're doing with Partner, I mean, everything you're focusing on fuel efficiency obviously has to have a noise component to it as well. Because
Right, so one of the things we try to do is to evaluate all options, whether they be policies or technologies, from a sort of multiple perspectives. So we'd like to understand what the noise impacts of those options are, what the climate impacts are, what the air quality impacts are, and then what the economic and market impacts are, ultimately what it's going to cost. And when you're trying to evaluate things on those three dimensions, and there's very different levels of uncertainty, with actually climate not being the highest uncertainty, but I think industry costs probably being the highest uncertainty, followed by climate and then air quality and noise. The trade-offs are not always obvious, right? But what we're trying to do is present those trade-offs so that people can then sit down and, with all the challenges, try to make good decisions now, right? And the best thing that you can do is occasionally you find some win-wins, or maybe where it's win-win-lose on a few dimensions, but at least you have a couple wins that stack together. We talked about a nice one that's happening collaboratively between FAA and Massport and other organizations, where we're saving a little bit of travel time for people at airports by metering the surface traffic at Logan, and at the same time saving fuel and saving local emissions. And we heard a great example at lunch of similar things like that. So occasionally there are some win-wins where you have a little more confidence about the way to move forward. But I think the best thing that we can do is to put all of those things on the table at once and try and make some informed decisions. And so we've been working hard to do it, right? There's still a lot of uncertainty.
I think another thing kind of comes back to the theme of this conference, innovation. We often think of innovation as bringing more technology, but really that's the easy part. The hard part is making it economic. It's bringing that new capability into something that the economic trade-offs support the performance goals, the technical performance goals, so that it can really be implemented, incorporated, put in place. And I think that also goes back to the conversation before about, well, we don't know how this fuels thing is going to go. There are lots of choices and options, and maybe aviation is or isn't the best. I think we have a big role to play there to help drive it to be a favorable solution. Ian, I think you said this industry knows how to innovate. I think we owe it to the world to apply it to the thing that we're all about.
I think airports have an important role in that. I think airports are important laboratories for both the development of the science, for the improvement in the modeling, or for the testing of the implementation. And I think airports are really stepping to the plate. And I think the stakeholders are often surprised by the results, that, you know, things are operationally easier than they anticipated, or that safety margins and delays are not as great or not incurred in ways in which they thought. So I think airports play an important partnership role with the industry, whether it's be the academic world or whether it be the airline manufacturing and the airline mainframe folks.
I think you talked about continuous descent approaches in implementing those. I remember when those were, they were looked at as, well, that'll never happen. You can't do that.
Yes.
And then the piloting community said, well, you know, I don't want to change what I've been trained to do. Concerned, legitimate concerns. But then you got into the simulator and they tried it out and said, oh, now I see.
Yeah.
And then started a little friendly competition among people in the simulator. I can do it better than you can. And then the trials, for instance, that MIT was involved in at airports was, again, further optimization and realization that, oh, this can be done, but, you know, here's some things to avoid and here's some things to work on more. So it's step by step, but having that focus, that vision in mind of where you'd like to get to.
Yeah. I want to reiterate something Ian said earlier, which is the FAA and TRB have been really very instrumental in helping to advance the science and the modeling, and they've put a great deal of emphasis on that in recent years, and I think that's a huge plus for all of us.
So just to sort of turn the credit back, one, when I say we in these things, it's certainly not me and MIT, or we've got a large organization of universities and industry participants and airports and government that get involved in these various tests that we do. But to give you an example of how forthcoming some of the airports are, we had a study that for a while we called the Una study, which was for, unnamed airport, unnamed airline. And what they were allowing us to do was go and measure pollutants between, I think, midnight and 6 a.m. in the morning out of some of their airplanes. Pollutants that aren't even regulated for airplanes yet, but because they were trying to advance the research agenda, but didn't want to create sensitivity in their local community. I mean, now that sort of has a name. It's the Delta Atlanta Hartsfield study and things. But we've gotten a lot of help from a lot of people, airlines, airports. And I think we may not do ourselves enough credit in shouting about that as much as we should, because people really are predisposed to help. And within all of the constraints of a big safety-conscious organization, people are, predisposed to try new things. But I'm not sure it's perceived that way on the outside.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Andrew, did you want to?
Yeah, just listening to the debate about the trade-offs from an airport perspective, local air impact and noise. In Asia, I mean, in America, you built your airports a long time ago. You sited them a long time ago, and you don't have much choice about relocating them or building new ones. In Asia, it's very different. We're building a lot of new airports, and you'll know that if you've traveled in Asia that many of those new airports are built well outside the city, and much of the local air impact is the vehicle traffic, ground vehicle traffic, and so you see mass transit railway systems being used as the preferred link to these remote city airports that are outside the city, but you're still within less than half an hour on the train to link right to downtown. The other thing is that these airports are built large from the beginning, and the land use around them is dedicated to people who are less noise conscious, that is industrial users. So you have a situation where you get these airtropolises growing up around the airports. Land values are very high from an industrial point of view. You don't make the mistake of letting houses encroach onto those areas and then being told 20 years later or 10 years later, there's a noise problem. Having said that, it's very interesting in Asia that a number of inner city airports, which had been effectively replaced by big out-of-town airports, in some cases are now expanding again because people are prepared to pay a premium for city airport to city airport services. So we see this in Taipei, we see it in Shanghai, we see it in Seoul, Korea. And you've got successful big out-of-town airports, and at the same time, the growth of direct city airport to business traffic in particular. Yeah. But overall, the trade-offs between the noise versus the benefits of having new airports, the leaning is different to America, or particularly marked contrast to Europe. Yeah. If you think life's tough as an airport manager in America, try Europe. In Asia, there's more of a balance in terms of what are the pluses of the economic activity, job creation, putting the city on the map into the economy, and that's traded off against these other trade-offs. Overall, I think the fact that the industry's been driving the noise footprint down is well appreciated. You've got modern aircraft, even big. If anyone's heard the A380, biggest aircraft, commercial aircraft flying, very low, relatively low noise footprint, and the same for the new Boeing generation coming. When the 787 flies, the same thing. Wow. How quiet is that? Yeah. So I think overall, it's up to the community. It's not up to airlines or airports to fight this out. It's really the community engagement problem. There are no perfect answers. It's this question of trade-offs, and there's a political dynamic to that. But it's something that needs to be watched very closely.
Yeah, I think that's going to have to be the last word. I've been signaled, unless there's time for a question. Is there time for a question? Is there a question? Have we answered everyone's question? One question, and then we'll have to run off the stage.
I don't want to be a pessimist, but as we eliminate noise, are we going to see, particularly with large aircraft, neighbors around the airport worried about this great mass of metal going over their head, and they'll still complain?
Leo, you have specific references at Dulles, or?
Comes from experience years ago with the Concorde, where people were clearly frightened by their statements of this giant aircraft which was going to come. Right. And there was some psychological research done which suggested that falling airplane syndrome was going to be a problem.
We're made of sterner stuff here in the States.
I do have a story on that, Perry. This is many years ago, John Wayne Airport, which is, as most of you know, I'm sure is quite noise-sensitive community, has been for a long time. And this was back in ancient times. The 757 was in development, and there was an arrangement for a test flight into John Wayne Airport just to see, how it would do in that environment. Well, sometime before the test flight, the airport informed the community that there would be a test flight. Don't be alarmed. If you see this new aircraft, it's just a one-time thing, and there would be a long way to go before it's approved for regular service here. The date and time arrived. The phone started ringing at the airport with complaints about the noise. The airplane was in Texas.
I knew you were going to say that.
The next day, the airplane did come and do the test with no pre-communication about the time, and they received one phone call, and it was somebody that said, "I don't know what that airplane was that flew over my house, but it sounded pretty good." The point is not that communities are wrong by any means. It's that communities do need to be communicated with, but with information, real information. We talked about that from the emissions standpoint, how you frame it, what information is available to people, put it in perspective. Same thing goes for noise and climate change concerns, and also safety concerns.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we'll wrap up. I'd like to thank our panel.